Start recording, and Jeff, the Zoom is yours.
And how many people are here?
Right now we have 10, but I'm assuming more will filter in.
Okay, great, thank you. Can everybody see me and see the screen? Good.
Yes.
So as Darren said, I planned for this to be a live presentation and not Zoom, which I've had enough of over the last 2 years. But we'll do the best we can. And if there are any problems or questions, please just stop. I really want this to be more of a seminar with a back and forth as much as possible, as challenging as that is on Zoom. And I just want you to know that it's a really broad subject, including woody plants and natives. So I've emphasized woody plants more than most other kinds of plants. And if you have any questions about something that's not woody, as Darren said, please stop and let us know, and I'll adjust accordingly. So looking at woody plants, I just wanted to give a really broad overview about where our woody plants come from and which ones we have here and which ones we can include in our landscapes, and some others that are not native but that also do really well here. And that's a very changing picture because of climate change. And we're generally getting warmer and drier with more extreme weather events that also affect how we can grow and cultivate trees and shrubs. So whenever I say tree or shrub, I mean both, just so you know. Also, this is not a radical idea, but I think that looking at nature as an example of how plants are exist together is a useful exercise in using them in the landscape. So that's something that I'm also going to be emphasizing in this presentation. So looking to nature, we can see that we're in a woody plant challenged environment. Most of our trees only grow in the montane and above, where there's more moisture and cooler temperatures, or along river courses and creeks and stuff like that. So outside of those areas, using trees in our urban areas and gardens is a challenge. So just to remind everybody what a woody plant is, if you look at this image, the top is exactly like a seedling would appear. So all of the tissue that grows in a woody plant from when it germinates from a seedling and throughout its life starts out looking like this and this, as a simple ring of vascular tissue that eventually forms a continuous ring that divides continuously. And what makes a woody plant woody is the cambium layer. So it's like a stem cell. It's always regenerating itself and always forming new tissue. So to the inside, it's forming xylem, and then to the outside, it's forming phloem. And the xylem becomes wood, and that's how a tree is constructed. And even in the bud, you can see already in all trees and shrubs, all of the growth is preformed and ready to grow. So that's why things happen so quickly in the spring, that it's already formed from the year before and ready to grow. And in some trees, all of that year's growth is in the bud. And in other trees, it's just the initial shoots that are formed in the bud, and then they keep expanding throughout the growing season. And then let's not forget roots, which of course anchor a tree or a shrub and provide water and nutrients. And now we know as well a lot more about how they interact with the microbial life in the soil, especially fungi, and use fungi to help them absorb nutrients and communicate back and forth with one another as a community of plants. So do y'all recognize this tree? Not a native one. Not very well used yet in Durango, although it could be possibly. Um, Ginkgo is, of course, the famous living fossil, uh, and it really illustrates uh, our tight bond with trees. Trees provide shelter, they provide food, they provide the air we breathe, they provide wood for construction, musical instruments, everything that we think of in combination with trees goes way back with our association with them. And I can think of really no better example than ginkgos. Everything that existed when ginkgos were alive is now extinct except for them. So all of those animals and plants that were around when ginkgos were all over the globe are not here any longer, and this is the only one. And then the further irony is the fact that ginkgos were not even discovered growing wild anywhere until as recently as maybe 15 or 20 years ago. They were always associated with people, so mainly temples in Asia, but always cultivated. And it really underlines how moving it is for people to be associated with trees of certain types, especially. So, if you've traveled around anywhere near the tropics or subtropics, you've probably seen this tree. Um, it's also known as Buddha's fig, the one that he supposedly sat under when he gained enlightenment. And as such, it's revered all over Southeastern Asia, is and venerated in much the same way as people do one another. And so people don't mindlessly walk under a tree like this and just go about their business during the day. They'll stop and talk to the tree and pray to the tree and pray for their family and leave offerings, and all kinds of stuff goes on like that all throughout the day. And if you see these trees, they're not just willfully removed because of construction or something like that. They're very important to people. In the Western civilizations, we kind of lost our close association with trees like that. And so it seems odd to us. But you might consider adopting a tree that you know and treating it this way and see what happens. So not a native tree here for Colorado, but we do have 3 species of larch that grow in North America. And then there's many more that grow through Europe and Asia and Northern Asia. And as you can see, it's a tree of the mountains, like aspen are for us. And everywhere it grows, just like aspen, it really lights up the landscape in the fall. And because it's a deciduous conifer, it has a lot of drama to it that evergreens others don't. So in the spring and fall, especially, it's a really, really remarkable tree, and you can't miss it in the landscape. And it's as important for people that live in the European Alps as aspen are for us for the same reasons. It's also a tree that we're able to grow here, and I'll show some examples of that later. Do we have any questions yet? All right. So I think another thing that really entices us to trees is the texture and pattern that they display in their growth. And it's one of the attractive qualities of trees that people either notice subconsciously or not. And it's really pronounced in tropical trees like this. And there's a term for the pattern that trees reproduce called reiteration. So if you look at any smaller part of this tree, you'll see that it has almost the exact same form as the whole tree does. And the whole tree, from when it starts germinating and growing, just repeats that pattern over and over and over again. And this is the result. Luckily, these are all knocked down by a hurricane now because they're a terrible weed where they were growing. Unless you've traveled around and looked at other gardens in North America, especially in the Midwest and Northeast and Pacific Northwest, you probably haven't come across this tree. which would struggle for us because it really prefers a different soil texture and chemistry than our soils provide. But Highland Park, Rochester is a prime example of an area where they've really been successful at cultivating trees in the landscape. And this is one of its main attractions. Cercidophyllum is Japan's largest deciduous tree. It grows over 100 feet, up to almost 140 feet tall there in Japan. And the Japanese rever it much the same way as they do cherries. For them, it has a lot of cultural significance. And it's a really beautiful tree in many respects. The name Cercidophyllum comes, of course, from its resemblance to redbud leaves, and it's a primitive tree with many characteristics similar to witch hazels, for example. And you notice a lot in the spring because it flowers before the leaves appear in the spring, and in the fall it puts on a great show. And this tree is probably over 90 years old, and I just love the way that it grips the earth there. So conifers are another major group of trees, especially for us here in the West, where we have so many native ones. And they're living fossils too, in much the same way that ginkgo was. They reproduce differently than other flowering plants, and their form is what stands out most. So that's called excurrent growth, where you have a dominant central leader that suppresses all the other shoots, and it remains the dominant shoot for most of the tree's life and gives it that columnar form. So I'm just going to take a real short tour through our ancient past and more recent history and have a look at why the trees that we're surrounded with are here now. So is anybody familiar with this tree from the Northeast and the Midwest? It's a dominant tree of the forest, mature canopy. They get to be hundreds, if not thousands of years old. The Europeans tried to cut all of ours down after they'd felled all of theirs when they arrived here. But you still see prime examples of white oak everywhere in the Midwest and Northeast. And Donald Culross Peattie, who was a naturalist that wrote a lot about trees, he said the plant kingdom has a king. And he was speaking of redwoods, but you could say much the same of white oak, especially in the Northeast where it's native. Each individual limb is as big as large trees that we see in our own landscapes, and the trunk itself is massive. So let's take a look at where oaks fit in the greater picture of plants, and especially the oak family. So Chrysolepis and Lithocarpus are both evergreen, and they're tied to more wet, warm forests than ours are here and would struggle to grow, but you may be familiar with them from traveling around. Of course, oaks themselves we're very familiar with, and bur oak is probably the most similar example I can think of, similar to white oak, and occurs naturally in Colorado. Some of our other oak species are all mostly shrubby oaks, and we have probably 6 to 8 native oaks, especially here in the southwestern corner of the state. This one here, you may recognize. Beech is a really important hardwood of the eastern and northeastern forest here in North America. Of course, Europe has its own beech, and Asia has a few as well. And there are beech in the Front Range that do really well in our old established trees. So if you look at the way that oaks are distributed around the world, you can see why they are such adaptable and hardy trees for us here in North America. We're probably the center of distribution for oaks everywhere. And of the 160 or 70 or so that are native to North America, probably at least 90 are native in Mexico, which leaves about 70 or 80 that are native in North America. And then you can see that it occurs at much the same latitudes all around the globe and in similar environments. So that's why most oaks are such good trees for us. So I wanted to step back a little bit further in time and show you just how we fit in here in terms of what we see around us. Look how old the Pikes Peak granite is. It's really the basement of the Rockies. And the landscape has changed back and forth so many times since then. It's incredible to look at the ancient history of the Rockies. Ginkgos have been found as old as this. So that's why you can see that people call them a living fossil and why everything else is extinct but them now. And then the thing to notice with this little insert here is the more recent past. And if you've never been to Florissant near Colorado Springs, it's a great place to go look and see what the landscape was like. There were giant stratovolcanoes there that looked very much like the Pacific Northwest does now, and made major eruptions that completely covered the Front Range and everything around them. And that's why Florissant is such an interesting place now with so many well-preserved fossils. And the flora that gave rise to our own here really started then. But much older than that, these are older than the dinosaurs. And this is from the petrified forest in Arizona. And this is when most of the Rockies was just a little island covered around almost completely by a sea on both sides of the Rockies. And these very well-preserved logs they're very similar to monkey puzzle trees that you found in South America. Now, the anatomy of the wood is very, very similar. It's very well-preserved, so it's very easy for people to study it. These got all washed in a flood and landed here. So this is the most prominent fossil in Florissant, and there's several examples of it there. And it's a relative of redwoods, and it's also so well preserved that you can actually see exactly how they grow, very similar to the way that redwoods do now. And these trunks are massive. Some of them are 7 to 8, 10 feet in diameter, and the trees were probably as large or almost as large as the ones that we see on the Pacific Northwest coast now. Another interesting thing about Florissant is that it was pilfered by fossil hunters in the 19th century, and so a lot of the things that we know about Florissant are from fossils that are now scattered all around the world. And the present superintendent of the park, Fred Meyer, he had a really great idea to assemble all of those scattered fossils and make a digital exhibit, which is online now, so you can look up all these different really incredible fossils from there. So this is just a really quick schematic to show you what was going on then. So in the Eocene, when those volcanoes erupted, the Pacific coast flora was warmer and wetter, so more like Taiwan and areas that have more evergreen floras and also more tropical like plants. And Florissant had a really rich mixed flora, but was colder and drier. And then as we approached the Oligocene later, and things dried out and got colder even more, all of the plants that weren't hardy enough disappeared and went extinct, both in the Pacific Northwest and in Florissant. And so you can see that a lot of what you recognize now as our native flora was already there and evolving, and a lot of it went to the Pacific Northwest. And then the Creed flora is really what preceded our present-day flora. So I don't know how many of you may be familiar with this particular juniper. It's native to the Sierra Nevada and in wider parts of the Pacific Northwest, especially California. And it's a really good example of how junipers are such shapeshifters. These trees are close to timberline in the Sierras, and they're probably 50 to 60 feet tall and 4 feet in diameter at the base. Really, really amazing. And then, of course, we have our native junipers, including all the shrubby ones. And it's a tree that's well adapted to mountain environments for many reasons. Western juniper is also one that can be cultivated in the Rockies. This is just an example. This is a northeastern forest, so you wouldn't see this particular scene here in Colorado, but something similar to it. But you can see that this understory here, that's beech that's growing under a mixed hardwood conifer forest. And it's a scene that I could live with forever in my backyard. I think it makes a perfect setting. And this is, of course, what we're left with here in the Rockies, where things are much tougher on trees, but they've evolved to adapt. And the prime example is ponderosa pine. Would somebody else mind reading that for me, please? Go ahead, Darren.
Oh, you people don't even volunteer.
I don't mind reading.
Thank you, Jen.
Sure. Of all Western pines, this one seems to be the beholder most full of light. Its needles, of a rich yellow-green, are burnished like metal. When the shadowless summer winds come plowing through the groves, waving the supple arms and twigs, the long, slender needles stream all one way in the current and in the sunlight, astronomically clear and constant, streaks up and down the foliage as from the edge of a flashing sword.
Thank you.
Donald Colrose Peaty.
I can't think of a better description for ponderosa pine, and that's a short excerpt from a 4-page treatment that he has of it. If you don't know him, look him up. He's a great writer about trees, Western trees especially. Ponderosas are like gamble oaks for us. People either love them or they hate them. It's a dominant tree, so it's difficult to cultivate much underneath them of what we consider most common garden plants. But if you're lucky enough to have them around you, you can't ignore how magnificent they are. So this is true of our native trees here in the southwestern part of Colorado, but also in a greater sense of the Rockies in general and of continents. And if you look at places where trees are most interesting and have the most diversity, especially genetic, and look especially at edges everywhere, that's where you'll see the most and best examples of trees that do well for us here. The prime example of course, foxtail pine. Our own native population is not quite as impressive as the ones in the White Mountains in California, but there is in the Mosquito Mountains a population of foxtails that are as big and almost as impressive and thousands of years old. I'll show you some images of those later. Foxtail is a young tree in Colorado, does really well, especially if you give it water. And you'll never live long enough to have it develop this way, but you can kind of get there in a sense. And here's the other extreme. So from a high tree line at the edge of where trees can grow to the lower edges where temperature and water are limiting factors. And as you can see here, soil as well. And I just think it's incredible that a tree that's this big and this old can develop in such a dramatic fashion. And this is right in our backyard. You can also see that these trees form a little community. So all of these mountain mahoganies that are growing around here, and several of the herbaceous plants too, are there because of the juniper. Again, back to tree line one moment. What you notice here is how the trees are so severely affected by the climate. There's no question at all which way the wind comes from and how much it's affected the growth of these trees. And then also you'll see that there's not just a tree, but there's a bunch of trees. And so trees naturally grow as a community of plants and help one another in lots of different ways. And we don't think in cultivating trees in our urban landscapes of using this as a model, and I think that we should. And you'll see better examples of this kind of horticulture in places like Vail and Aspen, where they do a really good job because it's their backyard, and for a good reason. But I think that we don't take advantage here in the Southwest part of the state of our high elevation towns to produce this kind of effect, and we really, really could. Again, just like the foxtails, you'll never have anything like this in your backyard, but you can approach it. And you can also see why, for example, the Japanese are so impressed by a tree that's this old and gnarled and incredible. This is limber pine growing again in the Mosquito Range near Fairplay, Colorado. And just to give you a sense of scale, that boulder on the right is the size of a VW Beetle. And it would take this whole class to reach around this tree. And the other thing to notice about it is these are growing kind of in the lay of a bigger mountain behind them, so they're protected from the worst of winter, which is why you have so much growth on them. But also, dead branches are a part of that tree for most or all of its life. And we're too quick to remove dead growth like this in our gardens and landscapes. And we should, as much as possible, within the bounds of good arborist culture, I think, preserve more of that kind of our trees than we do. Engelmann spruce, of course, is our most widely distributed native spruce around here. And this could be a scene from the La Plata Canyon, as well as all over the Western Rockies. And it is a tree that grows right up to timberline as well. And you can see how well adapted it is to our environment. Spruces in general are having a really hard time with climate change. And blue spruce is probably just going to completely disappear from urban landscapes especially. And it's already on the way out in a major way on the Front Range. Somebody raised a hand there. Who was asking a question?
Yeah, Catherine's got a question for you.
Oops, back to your previous picture where there were some what looked like dead branches,
Mhm.
and you said we're too quick to cut them off. I'm wondering why do you say that? So what's the value to the tree of those branches or to the aesthetics?
Well, I mean, to the tree itself, it doesn't detract in any way. Especially with conifers, they're so rosinous that insects are slow to attack dead wood like that. And so it's nothing that the tree loses anything from having a dead branch there. In a greater sense, it's more important because it offers habitat to all kinds of animals and other kinds of plants that would live around that tree. And that's what disappears from our landscapes when we remove dead parts of trees. And I know people, including Darren's own mother, who has owls living in her old house just because of this kind of thing. And you'll also see that that's something that Japanese people would pay millions for, that effect in a tree, not only in bonsai pots, but also in their backyards. And it's anathema to most people to have dead wood in a tree, but I don't think it should be. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Candy. I had a question about the spruce. I've recently retired here, and I was treating all my spruce in northern Illinois for needle cast. Is that the problem that you're seeing because of climate change, having to be sprayed to maintain their needles?
Darren can answer that better than I, but yes, I think needle cast is becoming a problem here. On the Front Range, they're having that and other fungal issues. And then, of course, the native spruce are being attacked by beetles in a really big way. And in stressful years, we have to fight off beetles from spruce too. But Darren, do you want to weigh in here as well?
No, you got it. I mean, we do see some needle casting in spruce and in pines, both native and introduced species. Our biggest issue is insect, which is primarily the spruce beetle. That's
Okay.
decimating the vast amount of them.
Thank you.
Spruce are really mountain trees, and in non-mountainous environments, they struggle just as aspen would. So that's one reason why people might be having trouble with spruce as well. Also, it's difficult to cultivate plants underneath a spruce, especially an old dominant one like you see all over town. So I mentioned.
Hey, Jeff,
yeah.
I've got a question going back a little bit, where you talked about our tendency to not plant trees in communities and to plant them more singly. And I have 5 acres where the spruce readily seed themselves like super close. So in that scenario, I actually have seen them. I had a clearing where it just was like a little plantation of them. And so I did thin them, but how close, would you leave them in a quote community?
It's really a question of taste. It's actually remarkable how close together trees can grow. And a nursery will tell you space them out as far as they can so that they can develop their maximum size and crown. But if you look around anywhere you hike in the mountains here and notice how they get along with each other, they can be really incredibly close. And if you have that many in a backyard, you can be pretty liberal with how you shape a grove of them, I'd say. It really won't affect the health of the trees. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
While we're on the topic of tree clumping, I'm wondering if it's similar to the idea of permaculture, planting different species or whatever in a maybe symbiotic way or way that they
Yes,
help each other.
absolutely. I would say so. Definitely.
Thanks.
So this is Engelmann spruce growing at near 10,000 feet in Eagle County. And that's a picture that's been unchanged for thousands of years, really. I also want you to notice that how effectively a tree like a conifers, and especially in this case spruces, shows up against the background of a sky. So when I said before, if I say tree, I mean shrub or tree, either one. And so I also mentioned before that juniper is a real shapeshifter, and it can be anything from a giant tree to a low shrub like this. Again, that junipers can grow at 10,000 feet under these conditions is pretty remarkable. And our common juniper is really circumboreal, so it grows all around the northern globe, the boreal globe, and looks very similar. But in parts of Europe, it does turn into trees, and it's the same species, but it's what we call polymorphic and can take on many different shapes. Common juniper was practically totally ignored by the nursery industry for decades and decades, partly because it's a slow-growing plant, and so it's not something that they can make a quick profit on. It's slow to reproduce from seed or difficult to, and cuttings are possible, but also slow. There are several nurseries that are producing it on a large scale now, especially Fort Collins Wholesale Nursery on the Front Range. And what they did was they traveled around a lot and collected cuttings from different populations that they thought would look nice in a landscape and do well, and then selected from those for how readily they could be propagated. And so they have several different cultivated varieties of common juniper now in the trade. Of course, horizontal juniper is very dominant in the nursery trade and has also been used to hybridize with other junipers. And so most people consider it a ground cover and leave it at that. This is a really interesting population from the eastern slope of Montana, way out, sort of like where Windsor or even further east here in Colorado would be. And this whole population of horizontal junipers are dwarfs. And they make really great plants for our landscapes. And this was collected by Kelly Grummins on the Front Range, and he propagated it and sold it for years and years in his nursery, Timberline, on the Front Range. Again, it's typical of plants from edge habitats that have had to survive under harsh conditions that we are able to find plants like this. Yes, Catherine.
So when my development was conceived or originally planted, there were a bunch of junipers throughout, including a bunch that were in my backyard. And over the years, I think like over 40 years, they became very woody and not so attractive. And so I know I spent 2 months last year pulling out all my old junipers and the roots, etc., just to get them out so I could do something different with that space. But I'm wondering if there's anything we could have done as a community to keep the junipers in better condition rather than having them grow so woody and unsightly.
What kind of junipers were they?
I don't know.
Were they spreading like Pfister junipers or something? Or trees?
Well, they were maybe about 3 to 4 feet tall, the tallest ones.
Okay.
But
I know a nurseryman who,
the branches spread out horizontally
Right.
like arms.
I have those here at home too. I know a nurseryman who, like in the late 70s, all the rage was junipers, and everybody grew junipers by the thousands and sold them and made huge money off growing junipers and selling them. And he would go around in his town 15, 20 years later and see how awful all of those trees turned out to be, especially for household landscapes and stuff, and how they were misused everywhere. And people thought then too that a lot of them were much dwarfer plants than they turned out to be. And so they really can be thugs in the landscape. But what you can do is rejuvenate the shrub by removing the oldest, gnarliest branches all the way down at the base. And you don't want to take more than a third of the total size of the shrub in any one season. But if you do that and take some of those older branches each year, the shrub will rejuvenate itself and go back to looking much more like it was when it was planted to begin with.
Thanks.
Yeah. So we can't talk about trees without talking about bark. And there are some trees, especially where the bark is the main attraction. And so this is just a very short little gallery of some of the most remarkable bark that you'll see on trees around here. Tell me what this one is, somebody. Even just a common...
Is that a linden? No.
Nope, not a linden. There are some lindens that do have bark like that, though. There you go. So this is a pine. It's a stone pine from northern China. So if you go to the Great Wall and anywhere north and west from there, and also into the interior parts of China, this tree grows way, way out on the edge of the steppe. And it's a very remarkable tree. It's got this, a lot of trees that develop scaly bark like this, it's a kind of a defense against insects and diseases because the bark is always shedding all that stuff. But this one has really taken it to extremes, and it's a remarkable tree. And it's one that we can grow here. There it is in Colorado Springs. This is the state champion, and it's growing on the campus of Colorado College. And there's a little grove of just a few of them there that are really incredibly beautiful and attractive. And Denver Botanic Gardens has several more growing now that are reaching this size too. And this is a characteristic that develops as the tree gets older. So as a young tree, it's got smooth green bark, and then this is what happens when it reaches a certain age. They're incredible trees. Cypress were another tree that was totally ignored by the nursery trade here for years and years and years. And then in the 80s, a few people started noticing that they could grow some of the cypress that are native to California and Oregon and Washington here in Colorado. And then they also started to look around at Arizona cypress. So if you look up in most garden catalogs and books, they'll tell you Arizona cypress is not hardy for our area, except for this one, which is extremely remarkably hardy and tough. And cypress is like a juniper on steroids. So as a young tree, they look very similar, but then cypress turns into this giant, beautiful, gorgeous 60 to 80 foot tree, maybe 50 foot in some other areas, that develops a huge trunk with gorgeous bark like this. So I mentioned that we're beginning to have problems now with spruce, especially in urban landscapes, and certainly also birch. So this is a picture that you won't see much of in the future, especially probably in 20 years, we won't be able to grow birch here at all, except for a very few. This is one the Europeans love, and especially in Northern Europe, because it grows really well there. It's a Himalayan birch, but it keeps this beautiful white papery bark for most of its life. And paperbark birch is the closest thing that we have to it here. And there is a native population of paperbark birch in Colorado that's really remarkable. And a few nurseries have collected seed and grown those, and it's hybridized with western river birch. And if you grow those, you'll get everything from pure paperbark to pure western and everything in between. It's a remarkable experiment. But again, bronze birch borer and extremes of climate are making birch a really difficult project for our gardens here. There's a few trees that I think are some of the most beautiful on the globe. This is one of them. I would say it's the most beautiful on the planet, but you may not have seen it, and you probably won't recognize it as an acer. But this is paperbark maple, and it's from central China, and it's a zone 5 tree. It does really well in the Northeast and in the Pacific Northwest, and there are some good examples of it in Colorado. It's a very slow growing maple. So it takes a long time for it to get established in the landscape and develop into a tree. But if you're lucky enough and do well enough with it, this is what you get. So I mentioned that I think that looking to nature as a model for how to grow and use trees in the landscape is really useful. It's not really radical, but it's not very widely practiced. So again, places like Vail do really well with this kind of horticulture, and it's easy because that's their backyard and that's what's around. But even in places like Purgatory and Silverton and Ouray, we could have this kind of effect in growing trees here. And of course, this whole community that develops around 10, 11, 12,000 feet all over the Rockies is stable and long-lived and in association with the trees around them. It's pretty obvious that there were a lot more spruce growing here that have been cut down, and that these are what are left. And so when you remove a forest at these elevations, that's what you get. But even as dead, trees really add to the landscape, I think. And this is a kind of a growing trend in Central Northern Europe and in places in North America too. They're called stump gardens, but instead of hauling all that dead stuff off to the dump or somewhere, leave it where it is and garden around it and see what happens. I think it adds a lot to the landscape. And you can see here, I mentioned that trees form communities around them. So this alpine currant is only growing here because of the tree that was there and got established and is doing really well. And this is a tree that was at 12,000 feet. This happens to be from the above the front range near Boulder, but it's a scene that we would recognize just as readily here with maybe just a few different kinds of plants. And again, a kind of horticulture that we should practice on a larger scale with our higher elevation towns. What I want you to notice, in addition to the fact that there's this great meadow with sedge and all kinds of interesting alpine herbs, that in places trees can start rejuvenating. And these seedlings are probably 15, 20 years old at least, if not older. So it takes a while. But this whole grove of spruce and fir back here is probably hundreds of years old. And so, like I've mentioned before, trees like to grow together as a community. And so that's what they do. And they help each other grow and get along and shelter all kinds of other life around them. And that's an effect that we could study and practice a little bit, even at this elevation, maybe with not the exact same species, but with something similar. And then you'll also notice that somebody mentioned earlier permaculture, there's not just a uniform tree here. It's not like you'd see on our urban streets. There's different ages, there's different heights, there's different species. And that's something that if you go to a nursery, you're not going to find because they're all in rows and they're all the same size and they all look the same. So it's something that you have to kind of develop on your own and experiment with. Here's a scene I could also live with in my backyard, and I'd be perfectly happy. Simple as it is, I think it's well balanced. It's really interesting in lots of different ways. Rocks provide shelter for plants around them just the same way as trees do, and they add a lot of drama to our landscapes. And what you'll also notice about this kind of association, most of the landscaping that goes on around here is what they call moss rock or even river rock, which is really not, it's out of place in a lot of our landscapes and gardens. And there are a few landscaping companies that are beginning to get interested in this kind of rock, which is this, this is Engineer Pass. So it's not that far away, and using more and more of it. But look how much more natural and interesting that looks than what you'd see on almost any urban street around Durango and the environs when you come to the association of rocks and plants. Subalpine fir does certainly well at 8,000 feet and above for us. It could grow at a little bit lower elevation too. I think it's a great tree. It does really well in the Front Range. It can get to be really old and big. This one is probably close to 90 feet tall and in perfect health. And you can see that it's got that certain slant to it that the Japanese love in their plants. This is a tree that arborists love to hate. And it's because even they themselves were probably guilty in the past, and certainly a lot of cities, but it violates the classic really common sense rule of putting the right tree in the right place. So it's been ripped out everywhere it got to this size in Durango. There's some hybrids of it that do still grow in town that do perfectly fine. But if you put the right tree in the right place, you get this really magnificent old well-developed trees that are perfect. And so that's what that is from. That individual photograph you showed before were these over here. But in this open farm landscape, these trees have developed to their full potential and are absolutely fabulous, I think. And they're not going to kill anybody or anything, I don't think, in the near future. You can also see this is an effect from the 30s and 40s when they told farmers to plant shelter belts. And so that's where a lot of these fast growing trees came from. And you can see how ineffective they are as a shelter. But in other respects, it's just fine. If you are going to do a shelter belt, the thing to do is to mix different sizes and different species and not plant one row, which is never effective as a windscreen, but plant multi-rows in a layer. So you would use maybe 10 rows spaced apart and then staggered with all different kinds of trees and shrubs, and that gives you a good shelter belt. Somebody has a question? Yeah, so no, it's not a recommended tree. Darren, I have a little bit longer, and then we're good for a break if you want.
That's good.
Okay. So, coming to thinking about how to use trees in the landscape, again, looking to nature as an example, I think it should give us some really good, inspiring ideas. So tell me what you all think about this. I'm not going anywhere until I hear from everybody.
It's like every backyard in my neighborhood.
Looks pretty boring. A lot of turf, not a lot of
It's
trees.
lonely.
Mm-hmm.
I just
Okay.
see a cute, tiny little tree.
What makes me wonder what the vision was for planting that tree and how long it's going to take to become a bigger tree rather than looking like it does now.
Right. Okay, so thank you. So what you'll notice about here is the whole existence for this landscape is grass. I mean, that's what they really want. And trying to plant a tree in a lawn like that is futile, especially if you're going to let the grass grow right up to the tree like that. And then you've all mentioned something about being boring or terrible. This is completely static. The tree is in the exact middle of everything there, and there's no movement or balance to it at all. And it's out of place completely. Look how much more interesting this apple is over here. Just so y'all know, I don't know if you know Lisa Beret. She's a great gardener and landscape designer here in town. And this was her old house on Ford Street, which they really loved and developed into a great house. That turned to a really vibrant yellow color, which was great. And this is the day that they bought the house. She said the people left and she cut the tree down before the ink was dry on the contract. And the garden tree you placed it with is nothing close to boring.
What did you say her name is?
Bourrey, Lisa Bourrey, Bourey.
Okay, thank you.
So does anybody recognize what this is a list of? They're just somebody answered. Thank you. Yeah. So this is a short list, by no means complete, of some of Frederick Law Olmsted's most famous and well-known landscapes. And he worked everywhere all over North America. He was practically the inventor of landscape architecture in North America, if not everywhere. He was inspired a lot by people that started doing landscape design on a big scale, especially in England in the early 1800s. He was a young man in the 1820s and 30s, and he used to ride around on horseback with his dad a lot and study the forest. And that's where he learned more than anything, he said, about how plants grow and how he might be able to use them. And so you can see, like, all the way from Stanford University to the US Capitol, to all over Massachusetts and New York, there's all these great parks that he designed, and that still are perfectly viable and important in the communities that he did this for. So this is Central Park. It was designed in the 1840s. It was planted before the Civil War, and you can sort of begin to recognize what he was about. Look at the traffic patterns for all the circulation, and look at all the groupings of plants. You don't see many straight lines, many rows, anything like that. And there's a really overall arching picture to this design that he thinks was very, very important and instrumental about what he was all about. Excuse me. So I'm going to give you a short close-up of a couple of his designs. But before we do that, we're just going to run through some precepts that he developed on his own and worked from throughout his life. And it was nothing like gospel truth. It was nothing that he wrote in a book and shared with a bunch of people. It's just what he did. And it's what he taught everybody that worked for him. And it's one of the things that really sets him apart from a lot of other landscape designers. So respecting the genius of place, it's all about fitting in with what's around the surroundings that you're working in. And it's almost common in trite that people don't consider where they're putting a landscape and how it's going to fit in with what's around them. And now it's even gone to the other extreme where what's around us has forced us to make landscapes that are totally ridiculous on almost every level. So a design, he thought, should have a really important element about an overall arching picture that everything else fit into, and that was really important to him. And then this one and the one after it are kind of hand and glove together. But he wanted people in his landscapes to really feel like they were not in an artificial park, that it was just like they had gone hiking in the woods or in the mountains or something, and they were looking at something that just grew there naturally and wasn't planted there or designed by anybody. And he wanted them to not feel like they were led around through the landscape, that they could just wander around and enjoy it on its own terms. And then this is really the thing that has tortured nursery production and sales and everything for years and years and years. And that is that we go from one fad to another. So one year it's geraniums, and one year it's crab apples, and another year it's fruit trees. And we just go from one fad to another. And we produce hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of the same kind of thing and sell it everywhere. And what we get is what we see all around us, all over the place. He didn't think you had to go to school to learn anything about landscape design. And if you just studied what was around you, you could learn from that. He thought it was really important to be able to speak intelligently about what you were doing. And he thought that the designs that he made was not gardening. It was really landscape design on a big scale. And then it was important for him that his landscape stood for something. So kind of the overall arching philosophy that he developed was that he was democratizing nature for people in cities, and that it was really important for people to be able to have examples of plants doing well in their urban surroundings for lots of different reasons. And really that a landscape should function for a reason more than just being beautiful. And then he wanted to simplify. He was always making his designs simpler and simpler and less and less, and not stuffed with all kinds of things. So here's a little vignette of a few examples from Rochester, New York. If you've never been there, go. It's one of the prime examples of great horticulture on a vast scale in an urban setting. They're blessed to have the Genesee River, which they turned into the Erie Canal that goes through the center of town. But you can see how very simple he made this bridge to cross the river. And the other thing that you'll notice is there's not a straight line anywhere, hardly. There's not an intersection with a traffic light and a hard right turn or a left turn or anything like that. And so that's how he incorporated his design principles. Most towns that have an Olmsted Park are lucky to have one, but both Buffalo and Rochester, New York have several each, which is amazing. And they're all really fabulous. This was where Rochester put its public zoo, which is, I think, now luckily on the way out. But notice how much he took into consideration everything that was already there around the Genesee River before he even started doing anything with it. And this is really his crown jewel in Rochester, Highland Park. It was built on land that was developed by a nursery that was right next door to it. And not only did they donate the land for the park, but they also donated a whole ton of the plants that were first planted and established there. And it was also used as a stone quarry for a while. So you can see that it has a lot of topography to it, and that this is this is the reason for the whole park really is Rochester has a gravity-fed water system that comes from the Finger Lakes that are probably 800 or 900 feet higher and a good 40 miles away. And so they get their drinking water still from all of those big natural areas that is gravity fed all the way to the city and then stored in these reservoirs and redistributed through the city. Again, notice all of his traffic patterns, how well they fit in with the landscape and move around. And so here's the park from the other direction. So we were before looking down this way, now we're looking up that way with a reservoir. And after the park was designed and planted, the city decided to put a big pavilion as a gift to all the inhabitants of the city. So this was a fabulous wooden pavilion that was three-tiered and huge. It was probably close to 200 feet in diameter. And it's gone now. They're considering rebuilding it because everybody loved it so much. These are his planting designs. And so each little one of these areas had more detailed plans about exactly which plants were there and plant lists of everything that got planted there. And this was also designed as a botanic garden. So the nursery that donated the plants wanted it to be a place where people could come and see all different kinds of plants and study about them and learn to use them in their own landscapes. This is the nursery I mentioned that donated the land and the plants. If you've never heard of them, look them up online. They're really remarkable. L. Wagner was German and Barry was Irish. They both immigrated to the United States in the early 1800s. They ran into each other in the 1840s, and in 1842 they started that nursery, and it existed all the way up into 1920. And their catalogs are absolutely amazing. They grew 100 different apple trees. They grew 100 different cherry trees. They grew all kinds of ornamental and fruit trees that were amazing. And not just trees, but also perennials and annuals. So this is the result. So this is about 35 to 40 years after the park was designed and planted. And you can see what Olmsted was going for. And although you have to have lawn in a park and people to be able to get through it and everything, look at all the plantings around it and how textured and layered and wonderful all of that is. And there are probably easily 500 different kinds of plants in that one area there. The park is 150 acres. And here's another part. And so democratizing nature, he wanted people to be able to enjoy a park on its own terms and recreate and get away from everything that bothered him about living in a city. And this is why he did what he did. And so he also used plants that we all know and love, like lilacs, because they're really tough and hardy, and they put on a great display in the spring. And it's something that people notice. Even here in Colorado, you'll see lilacs growing out in the middle of nowhere with nothing around them, and you know that's where a house used to be, probably 100 years ago or more. This is adjacent to what was called the rhododendron dell that I showed before, but look how color leads you right through the middle of this landscape, and how he's used all these different kinds of plants around to give texture and layering and interest and color throughout the design. And it's amazing that this was all put together in the 1860s and still functions as a perfectly viable and excellent park today. He really loved dogwoods and plants that made all this great kind of layered growth like this. And look how well this fits into everything around it. You wouldn't think that you were standing in the middle of a city there. Of course, rhododendron is a plant that we would struggle to grow here, but how well it fits in there, and he used it to great advantage. The picture I showed you before of the paperbark maple is this tree. And so there are, I think, 5 or 6. These are some of the oldest paperbark maples in North America. They're from the seed that was originally imported from China, collected by E.H. Wilson in the 1900s. And so he was traveling all over Western China looking for ornamental plants. He sent them back to the Arnold Arboretum, and the Arnold distributed seed to lots of different public and private parks and institutions. And so this is the result. It's really fabulous that they did that. And so, I mean, this is a tree that, again, is really threatened in China because of lots of different reasons. But even as recently as when Wilson collected the seed in the early 1900s, you see pandas hanging off branches of trees like this in China. And look how well it's adapted to Rochester. Olmsted also didn't want people just to have to look up and look at trees and stuff. He thought that it was just as important to think of the understory, and he used that to great effect to make all these different great sweeping palettes of all different kinds of plants. But especially in the spring, you'll see in this and in succeeding photographs how well this mirrors what's around it and fits in there. And so this is a little bit more of the Dutch style of planting and using bulbs in the landscape, but this is before most of the trees are on any of the leaves, and it gives almost a good month of really interesting and beautiful plants in this landscape before spring has even really started. Also, bulbs are so cheap, there's no reason not to use hundreds and hundreds of them in lots of different areas. Lilacs do really, really well in Rochester, and they went totally overboard later on in this park with them. And so now it's kind of become the central reason of existence for this whole park. They have a festival, the Lilac Festival, that happens every year. It goes on for a whole month. When all of these lilacs are blooming, and so people really overrun the park and have a wild time in May and early June when all this is going on. But a lot of those are actually the mother plants for several of the hybrids that we have in the trade today. I said Olmsted studied nature and took his ideas from it. American sycamore was a tree that he really liked a lot. It does really, really well in urban setting. It's almost indestructible in terms of insect and disease, and it makes such a statement. And he really went to extremes to make sure that these were planted at a high elevation in the park where you could see up through these giant 80-foot crowns, and look at them when the sun strikes the branches in the afternoons. We have American sycamores here in Durango. They do just fine. I mentioned larch. It's one of my favorite trees, which is why I included here. But again, it has lots of different interest at different seasons of the year. And look again, it's not just a larch in a lawn somewhere. Look how much more effective it is having a group of larch together. Because this is a botanic park, they're also growing this larch relative, which is a native to Taiwan and eastern China. It's a zone 6 conifer. But look how incredibly fascinating all of that pattern and detail are in larches. This is a spruce that we probably will be able to grow in 20 years. It's a zone 6, but it's the narrowest of all the spruces and really makes a statement in the landscape. I mentioned that beeches, there are beeches on the Front Range that are old and established and doing really well. Again, Olmsted used beech in the spring to great effect in the landscape. So just that's really the time to celebrate beeches and beeches in the spring when the leaves first come out, and they leaf out late. It's a tree that responds to photoperiods, so they wait until most of the rigors of winter are over, and then they notice that when it's spring, it is spring, and that's when they leaf out, and they're just absolutely gorgeous that time of year. Cherries too. I think cherries are a challenge in some respects for us, but people have not really been up to it and could use a lot more of them and to a lot greater effect than we see around Durango and environs here. This is a hybrid between Asian and North American cherry that does, or a European cherry that does really well, called snow goose. We could grow it here. Somebody tell me what this is.
Witch hazel.
Thank you. And why do you know that?
I had one. I had two actually planted in my yard in northern Illinois. I
How
loved
old
them.
are they? Yeah, they're great.
They're probably about close to 10 years now, but I love the yellow. Looks like little pom poms, shaking.
Yeah. Were yours fragrant?
Yes, they were.
Yeah.
They were.
It's a really incredible plant. It's also, it's got an ancient lineage. It's been around for a long, long time, and it's got some kind of primitive characteristics in the way that it grows and everything. But the flowers are really the most remarkable thing about them. And there's two kinds. There's Asiatic ones that bloom in the winter, so February, March, April, and then our North American one is a fall blooming one, and then there's hybrids in between them. But it flowers when almost nothing else is flowering, and it really stands out, and it has an incredibly attractive scent to it too. And there are some examples of witch hazels around town that are doing really well. Unfortunately, at the credit union in Bodo Park, they tore it out, the new owners. Who recognizes this tree? Any guesses? This is a dogwood. So there's only a couple or very few dogwoods that are in this group of dogwoods that have little tiny flowers on the branches before the leaves come on in the spring. This is Cornelian cherry is the common name, and this is the reason to grow it. Not only that, but I mean it's an attractive tree in the way that it grows as well. But it stands out in the spring for a good 3 to 4 weeks before the leaves come on, and look how well it matches with everything around it, especially this underplanting of Chianodoxa. We grow it here in Durango. It's really well established on the Front Range. It's a great tree for a lot of reasons. This is a tree we'll never grow here. It's a really beautiful one. You'll have to go to a botanic park somewhere to see it. I love it. But look how well the Aranthus are doing underneath it. And if you don't have these in your backyard, you should, because they're cheap, they're easy to grow, they're really interesting. There's probably 12 different kinds that all hybridize and make more new interesting ones. And it's indestructible. I mean, even in places that flood for weeks on end, they can still grow this where it floods.
What are they called?
Galanthus. 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 It grows wild in Denmark, and they have a little celebration with it because it's the first thing they ever see in the spring. And the common name is snowdrops for an obvious reason. But it really starts flowering when the snow first starts disappearing. And so the first people to see it, they'll pick flowers and press them and then send them to friends and family without any indication of who's sent it. And then they have to guess the recipient, who it came from. It's a lot of fun. Again, bulbs are
It's
cheap.
funny because right before the storm, my first snowdrop was up where the snow had melted against the house, and now it's buried under 3 feet of snow. And I've noticed they just pop back up when the snow melts. They're still there. They're
That's right.
unbelievably hardy.
They're great. And this one too. I mean, this one can turn into a weed in some places. It won't be for us. But at a few cents a bulb, why wouldn't you grow some of those and let them go wild in your landscape? And look how well they match everything around them and all the trees and shrubs.
Hey, Jeff, you have a question, but real quick, did you say that the Galanthus, they hybridize?
Yes.
Okay.
There's a whole society of people that are crazy about snowdrops. And if you look it up online, you can learn a lot more about snowdrops than you ever wanted to know. But
Okay.
be fascinated by.
And Catherine has a question.
Yeah.
Going back to your cherry tree, you mentioned that snow goose cherries do well here. I think I've got a Montmorency, something like that, in my backyard. There was an old tree, and now I've got some offshoots or some volunteers that are starting to produce little cherries. And I'm wondering how you'd compare that to the snow goose.
Well, it's an edible cherry, so you would treat it as a fruit tree, as a cherry tree, and I mean that's the thing that's really you get double your buck for fruit trees and shrubs, is they put on such a fabulous display in the spring. Just think of apple trees, even wild apple trees in a landscape. You couldn't have anything better than that, and there's no reason not to use them and let them go a little wild, and do what they can, because you'd be surprised. Darren will be able to tell you a lot more about cherries than I can. So if there's other questions, ask
Yeah.
him.
Do you know, does the snow goose, is it just a flowering cherry, or is it?
Yeah, it's an ornamental cherry.
Ornamental cherry. Yeah. So the Montmorency is what we call a pie cherry. It's a sour cherry. So it's definitely more of a fruiting cherry.
Thanks.
I have a few in my yard. The one that I grow it's called Des Fontaines. It's hard to find in the trade now, but it's a hybrid again between a North American and a European cherry, and it's huge. It'll get 50, 60 feet tall. So just think of a tree that size covered with flowers in the spring. And all of the Des Fontaines cherries in Colorado come from one tree that was at CSU in Fort Collins. And was that size. It was a magnificent tree. I think they cut it down to build something there now, unfortunately, but it's still around in the nursery trade. So this is burning bush, and since this is a botanic garden, everything you see here are burning bushes. But look how Olmsted used these in the landscape. There's not a row of burning bush. There's not a group that's in any way look like it didn't just happen there on its own, and they're not all look like Darren's head and pruned completely round and bald and in some magnificent weird shape. Just let them do what they want and be subtle about them in the landscape, and let them do what they do, and you'll be surprised. Japanese maples began to be discovered by Western gardeners about the time that Highland Park was designed and planted, and they do very well there, so well that if you wander around in this grove of trees that are probably 30 to 40 feet tall, most of them, you'd see the exact same effect in Japan if you watered around the mountains in the fall there. This is both Japanese and palmatum maples, but they really stand out in the fall, of course. And then just maples are so graceful in the way they grow. You'll see in town some Japanese maples do really well, but there's a new series of maples that are about the same size and growth pattern and everything that are coming out now. They're called the Northern Lights series or the Jack Frost series of maples. They're hybrids between a North Korean maple that do really well. I think there's like 8 or so of them in the trade now. I've got them in my yard. They're doing just fine. Somebody tell me what this plant is. And we're almost to a break if anybody needs one. You'd know it in the spring right away. This is peony. So peonies come in 2 kinds. There's silk peonies that do really well here and everybody has in their backyard that are great plants. And then there are peonies that are small trees or shrubs. Most of them are Central Asian to Eastern Asian and Southwest Asian. And they grow all the way up to the top of the Tibetan Plateau. And there's probably about 8 or 9 of them that make fabulous shrubs. They're zone 5, zone 6, some even zone 4. They're just as fabulous in flower as silk peonies are. And they come in some really exotic colors of yellow, stained purple, and pink and white. And they're also hybrids between tree and silk peonies that do really well for us here. But look how great they are in the fall.
Do they require a lot of water here?
No, it's not a xeric plant. It's more drought tolerant the older it gets. But if you give it water when it's in active growth, you can cut back later in the summer and it'll do just fine.
Jeff, real quick,
What?
I could ask a question or a comment. I mean, you obviously get people super excited about all these different plants and opportunities to grow different things in our environment that we may not think about. The challenge is that, in terms of acquiring these plants, we're down to, you have a pseudo nursery attached to you, but other than that, there's kind of slim
Yeah.
pickings when it comes to finding plants, and we just lost one nursery in the Durango area. So where do you suggest people go or ask or get these kind of plants?
Well, always support your local nurseries and talk to them in the fall before they order for the following year, because they actually can get almost all or any of these plants from the nurseries that they order from in the Pacific Northwest or the Midwest or elsewhere. Certainly not on the scale that I'm displaying here. And then branch out to other nurseries. So Cliff Rose and Cortez has probably more variety than any of our local nurseries and is a great place to go look for interesting plants that are really well adapted to our area. And then the Front Range also has nurseries that you get a lot more variety because they have a lot bigger customer base to deal with and people that are much more interested and knowledgeable about these kinds of plants. So ask around. And then like me, if you bump into people that are growing them or know about them, ask them where they got them and how to do them. And then go to Botanic Gardens. If you're not a member of Denver Botanic Gardens, you should be. And you should not just be a member, but you should go there like several times a year throughout the year, because you'll really be inspired. And if you hit the plant sale, any of the plant sales that they have going on there, you'll find tons of really great, interesting plants of all kinds. The spring sale is the largest one. And then also join plant societies. So I mentioned that there's a snowdrop society, there's a maple society, there's a society for every kind of plant that we grow, and they're great sources of information and plant material as well. Northern red oaks, there is maybe one specific northern red oak that we can grow here, but there are other red oaks that are native to the Southwest that do well here that you'll get this exact same effect from. So Shumard oak, Buckley oak, There's 3 or 4 that we can grow that do really well for us without any extra attention at all. I'm almost to a break, so I'm going to get there and then we can stop and answer questions. Olmsted knew exactly that this effect would happen with his design. And so people that can just happen upon this kind of little vignette that changes by the hour or the day, and you can just sit there and enjoy a scene like that and forget about a lot of stuff that's going on and be all the better for it. Okay, I see there's one here. Oh yeah, of course, Bill. The Durango Botanical Society is certainly a source of knowledge here recently. Darren, you want a short break?
Good timing. Perfect. Yeah, it looks like maybe Marjorie has her hand up if she has a question. If anybody else does, feel free to ask it.
Go ahead.
I guess where my problem comes in is that knowing what and when and how it flowers and how it grows and how big it gets and whether it's an underlay or whether it's an overlay. You know, in other words, this complexity of these of these beautiful gardens doesn't come with no knowledge. I mean,
Yeah.
how does one, I guess through this process, we can gain this knowledge of how one would create such a thing. But I mean, you almost have to know these plants intimately to know when they flower, which one flowers first, which one, you know, what color is it going to be in the fall, blah, 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 on and on. I mean, it just seems overwhelming to me to know enough to create such a garden.
Well, you'll never know
Do
enough.
we have to just keep on learning?
Yeah, we'll never know enough. And the more you expose yourself to different kinds of horticulture, the more you learn, and you bump into people that grow those plants and grow them really well and to give you all the information you need for how to succeed with them. And I've killed more plants than I've ever grown in my life. So trial and error is a big part of it. I was
Jeff,
going to look too. I think I have a book for you. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Isn't that a mark of a good gardener? How many plants you've killed trying?
I think Darren might say agree.
Jeff,
Yeah.
I wrote down, you use a term reiteration early in your presentation. I wrote the term down, but I didn't quite get the definition of that.
So it's a repeating pattern, and it's really noticeable in especially tropical and subtropical trees because they don't have a break in their growth cycle, and they just keep growing and growing and growing. And that's how they arrange their growth so that they get maximum benefit from the sun and can coexist with other trees. And so what reiteration means is if you take any tiny part of the plant, it'll have very much the same growth pattern as the whole entire plant might. You see a lot in cottonwoods do it too here, most noticeably.
Okay.
This is called fractal geometry, fractals.
Yeah, that's kind of the same thing as fractal.
So will there be some kind of walkabout, looking at different trees or something as part of this course, Darren or Jeff?
It could be.
Yeah, nothing planned, but we've done some tree and plant walks in the past, and they're fun for sure, at least in the Durango area. I know, I don't know how many people participate in the rock garden, the Rock Garden Society. They had some amazing hikes and walks last year. So those things do exist. Our native plant societies sometimes hold those. Bill, I don't know if the Durango Botanic Gardens has tours at the gardens behind the library. pretty well scheduled throughout the summer on a consistent basis. But yeah, we're happy. I mean, to walk with Jeff, I mean, the challenge, and I've realized this with Jeff and other plant fanatics, is you get about a block in about 2 hours. And so you don't really walk that far. You because there's so many different things that you can spy in a pretty short distance. But
Yeah,
Yeah.
you know, Darren,
yeah,
we'd be happy at the Durango Botanic Gardens to host a walkabout on the grounds. And I'd just like to hear some of Jeff's comments even about some of the trees that we have. Maybe what's things are not faring well, why. It'd be kind of probably interesting for the group, but also interesting for us to get a little counsel on, again, what we're doing right, maybe some things are not quite right, and whatever.
yeah, that'd be, I mean, once stuff starts to leaf out and flower out in the spring and the early summer, it'd be a great time to maybe get this group outside and walk through the garden and then the new areas you guys are building. I know you have a Cornelian cherry in there that's going to be pretty fantastic here in a little bit when it starts to flower out. So yeah, we'd love to do it.
Yeah, we also we do have a paper bark maple too. It's very young, very small, but hopefully it'll get to look something like what he was showing.
Last year, when I was starting to think about getting serious about gardening or taking better care of my yard myself, I had John Ott come out and walk through my yard and talk to me about the history of some of the trees that were planted in the neighborhood. And then later in the summer, Ron Stoner did a walk around in my yard talking about some of the things that were going on with my trees. And that was all really, really educational. So I was imagining something like that with Jeff could also be really spectacular.
That'd be great. Yeah. Or Jeff could just invite us out to his place and we could walk through his gardens too. Okay, it is 10:38. Why don't we hop back on at about 10:50? Jeff, does that work for you?
Yeah.
Okay, so you guys get up, get outside, go do a little shoveling. Lauren, help your husband out. But yeah, we'll do 10:50, come back in, and then Jeff will finish the presentation and then we'll have a lunch break. That work? And I'm going to pause the recording. All right, Jeff. So back at it now, and looks like we're going to talk about some vines.
Yeah. Most people, when they think of vines or use vines, it's to cover up something maybe, or kind of unmotivated. And I think if you study vines and how they grow and where they grow, you'll learn a lot about how to effectively use them in a landscape. So that's kind of what this little section is about. Whoever thought this up deserves a giant design award, I think. It's absolutely incredible what they've done. So this is a half timber frame house in Rochester, New York. And just imagine, it's easy to see how differently this would look without the vine and what the vine adds to the house, and even without any color to it. It turns it into a completely different landscape, if you will, or design. And this is the plant we're talking about, Boston ivy. We can grow here just as well as Rochester can. And this is the main reason why people love to grow it, because it gets outstanding fall color. And it's got really beautiful, finely sculpted leaves that are also attractive. But even without leaves, it's a magnificent vine. Just look what it does when it defoliates in the fall. And you can see how it grabs stuff and grows as a vine. So that's the other thing that you learn from studying vines in nature, is that some are twining, some use suction cups like this, and they have different modes of climbing around on what they're growing with. And that's how you learn to use them in the landscape.
I'm I'm wondering about their impact on what they're climbing around on. For example, if we have them climbing around on our stucco walls or on our wood walls.
They don't bother wood or stucco at all. The only thing that they bother is paint. So if you have to repaint something, then you're going to have to remove them and paint it and then put them back, which is easy to do. But they cause no structural damage of any kind.
Thanks.
Yeah. Whereas this one, ivy, can be a real thug in the garden, even for us, where it's typically like a zone 6. Some of them are zone 5 plants, but it can smother everything around it. But if you take a cue from how this one is naturally growing, then that is certainly how I would use it in my garden if I were to grow it, or as a container plant too. But it doesn't bother anything where it's growing, and it's perfectly happy and looks great on a rock wall like that. I love this one because the plant family that this one is in is mostly tropical. And even though this one is not, and it's a hardy plant for us, the tropical effect really is still there with this vine. And I think it's the reason why to grow it. And of course, hummingbirds love it, as do all kinds of insects. And it's great for that reason to add to a landscape. And it's just absolutely gorgeous. And even in places as extreme as Hatch, New Mexico, you can see it right there too. So trumpet vine is absolutely indestructible and can add a lot to landscapes. It's also very easy to propagate from root cuttings. And then we can't ignore the queen of vines, clematis. There's a lot to learn about how clematis grow. There's so many different kinds, species of them and hybrids, that the cultural requirements can vary a lot depending on how you should prune them and grow them and where to put them and stuff. But if you study up on them before you go to a nursery to select some, then you'll be a step ahead and be more likely to succeed with them. Let's see.
Hey, Jeff,
Sorry.
real quick.
Yeah.
You mentioned caravines. That's kind of something that I've always been curious about, of, leaving them up for dormant season or cutting them back down to 6 inches. Do you have a preference on some of our perennial vines and in the pruning process?
Most of them don't have any problem with hardiness. So unless they're getting overgrown or bothering something, there's not much reason to prune them until you get to the point where you need to rejuvenate it some. Am I understanding you correctly?
Yeah. So, I mean, for me, for example, I have a Virginia creeper that came with the house, that's probably 40 years old, I would bet. And it goes 30, 35 feet a year. And I cut it back down to 6 inches every year. And every year I get scared that it's never going to come back. But it's almost like a rejuvenation pruning, or if I cut it back that far, it'll put on 25 feet of growth every year.
Yeah. Yeah. It's amazing what vines will do. There's a funny story too about there are 2 kinds of grapes that are native to Colorado. And one of them grows in the foothills west of Boulder, it was one of the places that Greek immigrants first came when they landed in Colorado. And there's tons of Greek families there. And they didn't have their native grape with them, but they found that one growing in the foothills west of Boulder. And they searched around until they found one that was just as good for using in the kitchen as the grapes they use in Greece. And so in every Greek neighborhood in Boulder, they have that same grapevine growing all over the place. And they just step out the back door and go pick leaves and make dinner. And that's a wild grape. Nothing special about it, except that they found one that tastes really good. This could be a thing that goes on all day because there's so many great plants for the Rockies. But I just have a really short selection of some that I really like. So this is by no means definitive and inexhaustible. So It's just a quick little look at some things that I really like. Russian hawthorn didn't really come into the trade until the late 70s and early 80s. It's, as the name implies, native to Central Asia and Russia. It's an indestructible. In general, hawthorns are much hardier versions of crab apples, and they can take abuse of all kinds much better than a crab apple can, and still be perfectly respectably good plants in the landscape. They're just a bit slower growing than apples are. And this is just these were reject plants from a nursery that I bought. We probably had 10 of them, and these were in 5-gallon pots, and nobody wanted them because they were completely flat. They came out of a 5-gallon pot, and instead of looking like a tree, they just looked like a shrub that was going sideways. And I took all of them and gave a bunch to friends and kept one. And if I completely ignored it, it might turn into a tree, but I think this is partly genetic too. And so this is a crab apple, a hawthorn that would normally be an upright single or maybe multi-stem tree that got to be 15 to 20 feet tall. And I just let it keep being flat, and I prune it half to death every year and pile snow on top of it and keep encouraging that growth pattern to stay doing what it's doing. And it fits into the landscape where I am really well. This is what you get if you leave them alone. So this is a fully mature, big Russian hawthorn. And it's absolutely amazing that this is not a noxious weed in Colorado, because they have this giant crop of fruits almost every year. And the birds and the squirrels love them. But I've never seen it be a problem. Locally in its own landscape, you'll see a lot of seedlings popping up, but it's good for a lot of reasons. There's easily a dozen or more different kinds of hawthorns that all do really well. There's depending on what kind of hawthorn you're looking at, there's groups of different hawthorns, but this is a completely different group of hawthorns that also do well for us. And there is a thornless variety, but most of them have these thorns. I mentioned cornelian cherry, the dogwood, before. The wood is really hard, and it was used commercially for different applications for a long, long time. But it's actually an interesting fruit plant in its own right. These cherries, so-called cherries, are really high in vitamin C. And in Turkey especially, but also some of the Balkan countries and around the Black Sea, they grow this commercially for its fruit. And they've selected varieties that are really, really high in vitamin C content. And so it's edible, and it's really good. It's got a big pit on the inside, so you want to be aware of that before you bite into it. And the birds like them too if you let them sit around. They are also great as cocktail fruits. I've seen that at a party before where somebody had a dogwood that was had a lot of fruit, and they had a giant party with all kinds of different interesting drinks with cornelian cherries as the fruit. Another thing about dogwoods, it's easy to see the way they grow. They have opposite leaves. So there's a branch across from it, there's another branch. And so if you think about growing this yourself or buying one in a nursery, it's difficult to get trees that branch this way, like maples do too, and different other trees, to make an upright leader or a stem for a central leader for a tree. And so you have to encourage the tree to do that, to form a central leader, if that's what you're going for in the kind of tree that you want. And so the way you do that is you would remove one of the branches and pick one that's kind of already going upright, and then tie it straight into vertical, and that'll become your leader for the new tree. Okay, tell me when this was taken and what it is. What time of year? Fall, winter, summer?
I'm guessing summer.
That's close. So smokebush, European smokebush, is a plant that a lot of nurseries would only sell with a caveat because it's supposedly a zone 6. It's really not. It's more a zone 5. It likes a little bit sandier soils, but it'll do well. Just the structure that it has on its own is reason enough to grow it because it has a really beautiful bark that's smooth and an interesting branching habit. And you can see in the spring when it leaves out how dramatic it can be in a landscape. There's an American smoke bush that's hardier for us and worth pursuing. And there's relatives of smoke bush like three-leaf sumac that also is a native that does really, really well for us here. So don't forget fruiting bushes. I love currants, the way they taste, but they're also attractive plants in their own. A lot of them have really stunning fragrant flowers in the spring. And just from a few shrubs, you can get giant crops like this. And it's just something that you have to manage in terms of keeping birds off them and bears away when they're getting ripe. They tried for a while selling these in the farmer's market, but people didn't really know them, so they never really caught on. So I think they should try again. That was James Ranch that was growing a bunch of them. I love them. They're great. We have native currants too. They're all, even the native ones taste good. Okay, tell me what this is. Look on the outlines of the leaves against the sky. Anybody?
I'm not seeing it. I'm
It's
still,
a maple.
Maple.
There you can see there's a maple leaf and a maple leaf. This is big-tooth maple, which is native to Utah and parts of Wyoming and Idaho. And it barely makes it into Colorado and the very western part of the state close to Utah. And it's a relative of sugar maples that, since it's native, it's more well adapted to us here. And it's a great tree. So red is a color that you don't see too often in Colorado. And here's a red that I would recommend almost for anyone anywhere. This is a magnificent forest. I'll show you. That's what it looks like from a mile away. David Temple is the one who discovered this forest. It's the only population known in Colorado now, except for some that are in Yampa County up in the northwest, also close to Utah. But this is the Disappointment Valley. These are growing about 7,500 feet over several acres. And just for scale, this Douglas fir right here is probably 80 or 90 feet tall. And you can see these from miles away when they're in fall color. And if you were blindfolded and dropped in the middle of that forest when they're changing in the fall, you'd think you were in the Northeast somewhere.
So Jeff, this is Grandin dentatum. Is that what it is?
Yes,
Yeah, okay. And it's also called Wasatch
yes.
in the trade. Okay.
And here it is. I'm growing it before I knew that native population. Fort Collins Wholesale had discovered some growing in the Snake River Valley in Wyoming, and they started propagating from there. Selected on fall color. It can have yellow or orange or red fall color depending on what population you get them from. But these are consistently good orange and red fall color. And they're really graceful, beautiful trees, I think. And so I have no trouble growing them here at 7,400 feet. And they tend to be multi-stemmed, a lot of those. And that's fine, especially here, I think, because sometimes stags will come along and want to rub their velvet off. And if you have a multi-stem tree, they'll never get all the stems. So they'll take the outer ones and the inner ones will just be fine. And you can also select some and prune some of those away if you need to. But you need to do it at an early age because pruning maples, once they get to be over about an inch in diameter or too old, you get lots of problems with bleeding from the pruning cuts. That really affects the health of the tree.
And Jeff, on some of these, can you just give like mature size?
Yeah, so big tooth maple will do 40 to 50 feet tall and 25 to 30 feet wide. Is there anybody who doesn't know this shrub, which is all over the place in the spring? Again, you can spot it a mile off. It blooms the same time as our native shadblow, the amelanchier. And this is a relative of Philadelphus or mock orange. And you can tell them apart from a mile away because the white of Fendlera is even brighter and purer white than the amelanchier is. And they stand out on hillsides from way, way far away. It's absolutely gorgeous in the spring. It grows on pure shale in lots of other areas. It'll grow in full sun to almost full shade. And the flowers are really, really nicely scented in the spring. It's available in the trade, sometimes a little hard to find, but definitely not impossible. In New Mexico, this can be a problem just because it's so prolific with its fruits. I grow this in my own yard. It's absolutely, nothing will kill it or bother it at all. And this shrub is probably 15 years old, and it probably has 15,000 fruits in it every year, and the birds strip it in a matter of days. It's absolutely amazing. I mentioned Lisa Beret before. She found one that was in a nursery grown as an espalier, just like a fruit tree growing completely flat in one plane. And she planted it like that and kept pruning it like that. And so it has this really wonderful flat form up against a wall with all these great clusters of fruits. And in the spring, it's really nice too when it flowers. You won't find this in the trade. I grow it and propagate it. You can get it from other nurseries. It's kind of experimental for our area. It's a kind of a mountain ash, but it's one that can grow on our clay soils with no problem, and it's fully hardy otherwise in terms of coldness. And once it's established, it's a pretty xeric tree, and I love it for the foliage. It's also got interesting large brown fruits in the summer. Durango has experimented with tree lilacs. This is the one that they tried first. It does better on the Front Range than it does for us here. You can see why people like it. There's another species called Chinese tree lilac. It's Chinensis, and it's hardier and would be a better choice if you find it for our area than this one is. Okay, just briefly about conifers. California is really the main area for most of the conifers in North America. They've got tons and tons of different really interesting conifers, some that we can also grow. But I wanted to show you this grove of bristlecone that I mentioned earlier in Colorado. This is near Hoosier Pass on Mount Bras. It's a 2-lane dirt road that you can easily drive even in a 2-wheel drive vehicle all the way to 11,000 feet. And when you get out, you'll see these magnificent 3,000 to 4,000 year old foxtail pines that have survived up there, and are some of them more dead than alive, but each one is just really incredible. And they've propagated off these two that are in the trade. They're all really great. You also see this form up there. It's called a flag tree, and so for obvious reasons, you can see which way the wind is blowing, and it completely strips everything alive on the windy side, and all the growth is happening just in the lee of the trunk. So just the width of barely one person is all the growth on that tree. So it's really interesting, and you can replicate that effect artificially in a garden easily. Look at this one. So you can see the wind and the snow have just scoured all the living tissue off one side of this tree, and everything that's supporting all the growth is just wherever it can exist in the lee of the wind. And even this potentilla is doing the same thing. And this potentilla is probably 70 years old, and that tree is 2,000 years old easily. So we don't really see foxtail growing natively here in southwestern Colorado, but limber pine does. And this is limber pine growing along the Front Range above Boulder in the Flatirons. But you can see how easily it survives in very harsh conditions. And it's a gorgeous tree, even as a young specimen. It's very closely related to our own native Southwest white pine, just on a smaller in every dimension and scale and everything. And there's also dwarf varieties of it that are really interesting and worth growing. And here's Douglas fir. A lot of the Douglas firs that are sold in nurseries are grown in the Pacific Northwest. And it's better if you can choose a local provenance for seed and production. David Temple is one to talk to about their Trail Canyon trees. But grow our native Douglas firs. They do really well here. And some are even really xeric because they come from canyon country in Arizona and Utah.
So I had a question about the estimation of a 2,000-year-old tree when you can't cut through and count rings or something like that. How do you know it's about 2,000 years?
You can core them. So that's how they study trees now. Is you can take it's called a core, but it's like a corkscrew that you can screw into the tree, and it just removes a little narrow strip of the tree, so it doesn't hurt the tree. The wound closes by itself from all the sap in the tree, and then you've got a whole profile of every growth ring of the tree.
So, but how would you know from looking at a tree how old it was? Or maybe,
You can count the rings from a core.
oh, but without having that core, if you're just looking at the tree,
Now, you wouldn't know.
you wouldn't know. Okay.
And one of the reasons is especially with conifers, the older they get, the less they grow every year. And a lot of them flatten out in the top too. They lose the apical dominance. And so older conifers tend to be broad and flat instead of upright like they were as a young tree. And that's just a characteristic, just like we get hair and stuff as we get older.
Thanks.
And they're actually in California, a stupid graduate student cut down a bristlecone tree to count the rings, and he cut down the oldest one that was in existence in that grove on the White Mountains before they found another one. He wasn't very popular after that. I mentioned Arizona cypress. A lot of the cypress that are growing around the rim of Grand Canyon and in the Mesa country there is probably not as hardy as this population. And this is, again, an example of an edge environment that is selected for Arizona cypress that are fully hardy and really rugged and absolutely amazing trees. I mean, look at this is Deming, New Mexico, 20 miles north of the Mexico border. And this is a sky island. Cook's Peak is maybe 8,200 feet tall. And on the north side, there's a grove of Arizona cypress that have been there for thousands and thousands of years. And that's where all of the ones that we have in the trade now that are officially hardy are from. The Alan Taylor, who's really well known in tree circles, he went up there and collected seed and started growing it and gave some to Denver Botanic Gardens and some of the nurseries. And that's the one that's in the trade. And you'll see, I mean, everything around it is cactus and ocotillo but that's it. So that's a tree that's 40 to 50 feet tall and 30 feet wide. That's what it turns into. And look at these branches. They cover almost acres and acres. It's absolutely luxurious, fabulous looking growth on a tree that's probably 800 years old. And there you can see the fruit. The fruits of cypress the cones are really globular. And they take several years to mature, and it takes a fire to open the cones, or eventually they'll open with a hot summer or something like that. So the first year the seeds are immature. You have to wait at least until the second year before the seed is viable, and they can still remain viable on the tree many years after that. Pinyon pine. It's certainly well adapted to a lot of the desert Southwest where we are, and does well in our landscapes, especially if you don't irrigate it or put it with plants that are irrigated. Jays are dependent on it. It's a great tree in many respects. And even single leaf pine, which is very closely related to it, you can grow here as well. If you haven't looked around at our native populations of white fir, I think it's a really great tree. It's the all-around best conifer, I think, for our area. If you can accommodate its size, there's also varieties that are not so big because as a mature tree, they're huge. They get 80 feet tall and 40 feet wide. If you go up to Hermosa, you'll see giant ones growing up there. Falls Creek has really nice populations. The Forest Service doesn't like them because they can get diseased and be fire prone. So that's why they let you cut them down as Christmas trees too. I could have left this out. I'll run through it pretty
Excuse me,
quick. but this-
Jeff,
Yeah.
sorry. What's the difference between a fir and a pine?
Well, they're in the same family, but fir needles are like spruce. They're not in bunches like pines are. And unlike spruce, they're very pliable and soft. They don't stick you like a spruce does. In the cones on firs, they stand up and fall apart after 1 year. On pine trees, the cones remain usually for more than a year. So once you see them side by side, you'll recognize the difference. The library garden has examples of both.
And Jeff, I may have missed it, but did you mention bristlecone pine? And if not, is there a reason why? Do you like it?
No, well, that's foxtail.
Oh, okay, you did mention it, sorry.
Yeah. Look how gorgeous maples are in the spring. Even some are got really ornamental flowers. And this is vine maple, which is native to the Pacific Northwest. If you ever travel there in the fall, you'll see it all over the place because it really turns the mountainsides red. And there are nurseries in the Pacific Northwest that know that it would do well here. And there are interior populations that are on the eastern side of the Cascades that are away from the ocean and grow in conditions that are more similar to ours. And those are the ones to look for if you want to grow them. And in every respect, they're a lot like a Japanese maple and a good zone or two hardier. There it is in the fall. I mentioned fashion whims that come and go in nurseries. This is a really great cherry that's never really made it into the trade. It was for a little while. It still exists in Fort Collins because a CSU professor is the one who made the cross and developed it. He named it too. And you'll still see it in parks in Fort Collins. And it's a big shrubby cherry that gets maybe 8 feet tall and 10 feet wide. And it's got great spring color before the leaves in the spring. If you're interested, then ask Fort Collins Wholesale Nursery and they'll track it down for you. I love species roses. I grow a lot of different ones, not necessarily all native, but there's no reason not to look around for your own special native woods rose that you like for a lot of different reasons. Some of them have bigger flowers, better fall colors, bigger hips, and they're generally more disease resistant than a lot of the other hybrid roses that we want to grow. You just have to put up with the fact that they're single bloomers and they don't repeat bloom during the summer. It's a great rose for a lot of reasons. So I mentioned birches. Our western native river birch and this one is called bog birch are the two that may be more successful for us in the future. Generally, they're not as prone to the problems that the silverbark birches have. If you go to Silverton and Ouray, you'll see this all over in the fall. It's just absolutely stupendous and you can't miss it. It's really easy to propagate both from cuttings and from seed. At our elevations down here, you'd have to find a special spot for it because it's an alpine plant, so it wants more moisture and cooler temperatures, but you could do it. And then western river birch, of course, is much more amenable. Somebody tell me what this is, please. You know Kinnickinnick? Kinnickinnick is all over the Rockies, but oddly enough, it's spotty down here. You'll see it on the western side of the La Platas, but nowhere on the eastern side. You'll see it at maybe Coal Bank, but not Molis. It's weird how it grows, but when you get up into the central and northern part of the states, it's really everywhere. It's a great shrub for a lot of reasons, and it hybridizes with some other manzanitas that are native to California and Utah, and it makes these great plants. And these are all in the trade through Plant Select. So if you go to plantselect.org online, you'll find this as well as a lot of other great plants. You can grow almost all of them, and they're already selected because they're great for our landscapes for lots of different reasons. It's one of the few ericaceous plants that are native to Colorado. This is a really interesting, very tiny population of a dwarf Pennsylvania cherry. That's a tree back east. And somehow this population survived here, and it never gets any bigger. And it makes this great mounding shrub all over the place. And this is growing 9,500 feet. It's been propagated at Denver Botanic Gardens. Now horse chestnuts are in the same family as maples. It's not obvious for a lot of reasons, but look how absolutely flawless this this buckeye is here. We can grow yellow buckeye and Ohio buckeye both. They're great trees for our area. They're kind of slow to begin with, but they eventually make really respectable shade trees that get to be 35, 40 feet tall and just as wide almost, and have great fall color too. Easily grown from seed. Just like oaks, buckeyes make a taproot, and that presents a problem for nurseries that have to move them into larger containers or bigger size balls and burlap, because you have to, it really upsets a taprooted tree to dig it up and move it. And so if you're trying to grow them yourself, you want to encourage a better fibrous, more compact root system, and you do that by cutting off the taproot, either by air pruning it in the pot that you're growing in, or physically cutting off the root. Here's our Western River birch. You'll see it all over around here. It's really attractive for a lot of reasons. This is the ornamental maple that a lot of people wanted to grow here in the 70s and 80s. And just like some other maples, it doesn't like our heavy clay soils, and it gets chlorotic and doesn't like really growing here very much at all. There are places that it will do well, and it's an attractive, especially in the fall, tree. But the other one that does do really well here is the one called Hot Wings, and it's the one to choose. These are all native plants that you could grow in your backyard. They just take a little studying because they have very specific requirements. Twin flower is a honeysuckle, and it makes these massive, really gorgeous, dainty plants. Mountain dryas grows almost everywhere above timberline here. If you have a rock garden and the right conditions, you can grow it. This is another native ericaceous plant. So just like the ones that grow in the east, Kalmias are really gorgeous, and they occur naturally here. They got great fall color. It's an evergreen plant, but they do change color too in the fall. And there's our native blueberry, which grows everywhere in the mountains. It's amazing. They're all probably the same clone because they reproduce from the roots. In this one, you could grow in a trough or a container, again, because it's an alpine plant and it won't take kindly to hot, full sun here, but in a container in the right shaded place and given the right moisture, it's a really beautiful dwarf willow. Never gets more than 1.5 inches tall and can cover many square feet. And of course, maples are male and female, so you can collect cuttings off it in the summer and root them and get it established that way. Or if you collect the seed just as it's ripening and sow it right away, you can germinate seed that way too. I love it as a great maple or willow. This one is slow, but indestructible and easily grown. And it's again, really widespread all the way through the Rockies and all the way to the Pacific Northwest coast and up into British Columbia. It's a little spirea relative. You won't find it naturally occurring here, but if you go to Rifle and anywhere north and west of there, you'll see it everywhere. And it can get lots and lots of these little great pom-poms, and the foliage and the way it grows as a ground cover is really great, especially over rocks. Penstemons are all native to North America. We have several different ones that grow in our area just by themselves. And then if you go north and west, and there's even more and more of them, and some of them are shrubs, woody shrubs. This is one from the Sierras that does well for us. It's evergreen. They've got either this one or one like it growing at the library garden. This is a native in central Colorado that also does well for us. Great ground cover, great flowers. This is related to one that does grow everywhere here called Linearioides, is also another great local penstemon. And we're close to the end of today, but here's a brief example of what we get out of nurseries. So I mentioned before, if you go to a nursery, they're all going to look the same, just like this. They want all their plants to be uniform. They want them all to be the same size, the same varieties, and they're all treated the same because that's the easiest way to grow them. You can learn how to do this. Some of these are seedling grown and some are grafted. If you've not learned how to graft trees, it's not difficult to learn how to do. And now, what's the orchard group? Montezuma Orchard.
Yeah,
Gives
Montezuma
several classes
Orchard Resters,
a year during the winter on how to graft trees. And grafting ornamental trees is no different from grafting fruit trees. So if you learn it, you can do it yourself. I'm amazed. I sent this article to Darren. He never replied, but he should. This was developed in the Midwest, and remarkably enough, it was practiced successfully in, of all places, Cheyenne, Wyoming, where trees don't grow very well at all. And it short circuits a lot of the problems that you have with nursery grown trees, especially balled and burlap trees. When you buy a balled and burlap tree, it only has 20% of the root system of the tree. And that's just, it's unavoidable in the way that they have to be dug and moved around and grown. But if you can plant a bare root tree, you've got closer to 80 or 90% of the root system, and they establish very quickly, much more quickly than a balled and burlap tree, and even more quickly than a container tree does, and they have none of the problems. And the other thing about container trees and balled and burlap trees is you can't see the root system. And a lot of problems arise because a lot of times a tree in a ball is too deep, and you need to excavate the top of the ball off sometimes for several inches before you actually find what's called the root flare, or the part of the tree that actually should be at ground level. With bare root trees, that's not a problem. The only thing about bare root trees is there's a short planting window. So you have to, in the spring is a short window, and in the fall is a short window when you can plant them and move them around without fear of drying out the root system. And so they make these gravel beds, and they put these trees in the gravel beds, and they can store them there all year long, even sometimes over a season. And when they're ready to plant, they've got everything ready. They pick up the trees. They don't need heavy machinery to move them around, and they can just walk around and stick them in a hole and plant them and be done. And the trees take off really, really well. And so they've turned them into master gardener projects, community projects for Boy Scout and Girl Scout troops, and interested neighborhoods that can just make their own like this. And you can do it on a lawn. You can do it on an asphalt surface. You can do it on concrete. Anywhere you can pile up gravel and contain the sides, you can make this happen. And it's worth pursuing. And the guy who tried it out in Cheyenne had to eventually stop because it's just too extreme a climate up there for trees that are done this way. But he says that he thinks Durango would have a good shot at making it work. That's what they look like. So that's almost the size of what you would get in a nursery, and look at the root system and how easily that's transported and planted. A lot of people wonder about dwarf trees and where they might come from. A lot of the dwarf evergreens are the result of genetic aberrations that happen because of a virus infection that just redirects the growth to grow like the virus wants it to be. And so you get these witches' brooms like this. And that's where a lot of our native, not our native, but our dwarf conifers come from. There is a good selection of native dwarf conifers too that you can get now too. If you can take graft, you can graft from a thing like this. You can sometimes make cuttings successfully from a thing like this. And even if a witch's broom gets cones, you can sow the seed from the cones, and most of them will be dwarfs. It's really cool. That's where this one came from. So this one is in the trade now. This is a blue spruce that was discovered by Jerry Morris in Marble, Colorado, growing in a blue spruce that was, this thing was the size of a VW bus and 80 feet off the ground. And he'd watched it for years and he knew it would make a great plant. The only way he could get material is to shoot it with a 22, which is what he did. So he shot off a bunch of the branches and he grafted them, and he got this into the trade. And it's a great little dwarf spruce for us. This is not a dwarf, but this is a great Rocky Mountain juniper, so native. And it's much better than Wichita or any of those other upright ones because it holds a snow load much, much better. And it gets exactly 15 feet tall and 3 feet wide. This was developed from seedlings from a witch's broom. It was collected by Alan Taylor, and this is planted at Durango Nursery. So if you go to the nursery, just as you drive in, just on the left, you'll see this tree. Unfortunately, this side has been really badly encroached upon by a apple tree growing next to it that I would have cut down. But anyway, look how gorgeous that is. And you don't have to have a 90-foot tall ponderosa that dominates the landscape and takes years to get that size. You can grow this one and be perfectly happy. That's 8 feet tall and 7 feet wide. This is European larch. They were grown from seedlings from trees that are grown in City Park in Fort Collins. The city arborist there, Tim Buchanan, is the one who planted them and started growing them there. And the ones there are great. They're tall, mature trees. We got them going here in Durango in City Park, or no, what's it called? Santa Rita Park. And unfortunately, all that construction that happened around this area killed these trees off because the city cut off the water and they died. But these were well on their way to becoming great specimens for Durango. Lodgepole is not native for us here. It is in central and northern Colorado and further north. This is a yellow branch selection, so it's great for a lot of reasons. This is in the trade now from the Pacific Northwest. There's one that turns golden in the spring with all the new shoots, and there's another one that turns yellow in the fall. You see this all over town. Take advantage of this Master Gardener class and learn how to prune trees correctly, and you won't end up with this sorry mess. These are all over the Fort Lewis campus. You'll see them everywhere. Again, this is just an example of something that probably could have been avoided if it had been taken care of when this tree was much younger, but it got to the point where everything was too far advanced and the good wood was weakened too much and it just split in a storm and could have been a big hazard. That's Norway maple, by the way. There's a few new tricks that arborists have learned how to deal with problem trees. I mentioned that in balled and burlapped and container trees, you can't see the root system. So there could be a lot of problems in a pot or a root ball that will happen to appear later after the tree's been in the landscape, and it either doesn't grow very well or very much, or it just isn't thriving. And 9 times out of 10, it's a root problem if you can't find anything else going on with it. And so this is what's called an air spade, and it's compressed air, very tightly focused, and it works just like a saw, and it'll cut anything off up to several inches in diameter, depending on what size one you have. This is Animas Valley Arborist using this one on a larch tree that was having those troubles. You'll find trees like this in nurseries all over. Unfortunately, a lot of nurseries, they don't take the time to prune trees when they're growing them structurally as a young tree. They really should, but they don't get any extra money for making a tree better that way. So they just go out the door. And a tree like this has all kinds of problems because of the way it's growing, and they're hard to correct. So just don't even bother to buy a tree like that unless you're going to propagate off it and throw it away. And so the main problem you see is that all the branches are coming from the same point. You want branches to be well spaced out on a trunk and not all together like this and all the same size. And that'll just break apart eventually because of snow or whatever later on. And it looks ugly too. Easy to fix as a young tree.
Can they fix that now, or is it too late, Jeff?
It's almost too late. It sets the tree back too much. Once a branch gets more close to an inch in diameter, unless it's already a much bigger tree, it's a problem. If you haven't already, you'll learn a lot more about soils in your Master Gardener's class, but this is basically what we have to deal with here. And you can see why trees are such a challenge for us underground as well as above ground. The organic profile there is not very big. And this is my neighborhood. Mostly, you'll find a lot of information about this kind of soil from engineers than you will from agriculturalists. They know a lot about it. So in my own backyard, we've been here about 15, almost 20 years. We can get really hot and dry during the summer, and those clay soils get really expansive. And so we'll get cracks developing in the yard that our French bulldogs can disappear into sometimes. And even though we have 100 ponderosas like this that are big second growth trees, we get like 10% shade from them in the summer when the sun is overhead and the shade is all directly underneath the tree. And so what I've taken to doing, both in terms of accommodating our soil problems and the extremes that happen from hot, dry sun, is taking advantage of the shade that's already there. So I turned this into a project to make a gallery forest, which is what you would find along a stream. It's trees that grow more or less in a big line and can be of varying widths. And so I developed new beds that are raised above the soil with amended soil that's much better for rooting trees and getting plants established. And so the ones that needed the most protection from the hot sun all get planted here. And then where this hot sun is, I planted shade trees. So I'm moderating the extreme conditions towards the middle to accommodate a greater palette of plants that I like to do. And so there's that really hot sun. It's almost even too hot to just stand in during the day. And so this is what it turned into. And so a good time of year to do this is in the fall after we've had some monsoon moisture, and you can actually work with the soil. And actually when it begins to dry out, and you won't compact it either by being on it with machinery and stuff. And you get a much clearer picture of what you're doing in the fall. And then the conditions for establishing new plantings are much better too, because we have more moderate conditions. There's more moisture, everything's cooler, the soil is still warm for root development. It's a great time for planting woody plants especially. And so here's Shumard oaks and American sycamore. They're going to give shade where the sun is now. And then here's amended soil for all the plants that would never grow out here, but have a chance of growing in here. And even here you can see the amended soil. And over here you can see I've got really coarse, sharp sand to mix with native topsoil that I can buy in the nurseries. And then I've got crushed shale from a construction project to aerate the soil with. And so that gives me what I need for the raised beds, and I can just plant directly into it. And then here you can see it, even already just weeks after it was planted, things are really starting to show up and take advantage of the soil temperatures and the cooler weather to get established. And you can see we have deer problems, so that's my solution for that. Unfortunately, so you got to look at a lot of tea stakes for a while. I planted vines on those, so that whole fence will disappear in vines in a little while. And the fall color is what I wanted. So there's the oaks and a really nice orange maple and then plants here that you'll never see in the trade anywhere that people say you can't grow here that will. This is a great resource that's online. I've got the link, I sent it to Darren. They interviewed a bunch of nurserymen and landscape architects and arborists along the Front Range to see from their 20 or 30 years of experience with trees what did well, what didn't. And so they made this system for rating which trees after all that time did or did not do well. And there's a list of just about everything that's in the trade on this website. And so you can see what's the plant, what the rating they gave it to, what problems did it have, and any special comments here. And you can, this is a PDF that you could also turn into an Excel spreadsheet and organize any way that you want to. So it's really useful information. There's a spreadsheet I made out of it. This is a short little exercise that you all would benefit from doing for learning as much as you can about, you can use it with any kind of plants. Botanists do it. You can only fit so much in your head. But if you take an unfamiliar plant group that you are interested in and study it over a whole year, by the end of the year, you'll know it. And so if you don't know much about maples, make this the maple year and learn all you can about maples, and then pick a different group for next year. And so you can make a book like this. So as an example, if you want to learn about the taxonomy of maples and which ones are which and how they're all related, this is the first one that was officially named by Linnaeus. That's who that is. That's how he came up with a genus name for maples, which used to be in their own family, but now they're in this family. Where do maples grow? By their own. They're all in the northern hemisphere, so they all, like oaks, you can kind of guess what kind of conditions they'll thrive in. That's how many, there's 2 genuses and about that many species. Learn the botany of things, because it's really helpful and useful to you to learn these details, because when you see one that you don't know, it will be much easier to figure out what it is. So that's just all about how a maple grows and what it looks like and what to look for to see, to identify it. Learn about the ecology. What pests and diseases do they have? What thrives on them? And what beneficial things are that grow with them? So just as an example, there's leaf peepers in the fall. That's a huge touristy industry. There is maple timber that U.S. Forest Service grows. Maple syrup, horticulture, of course. Make your own gallery. Start taking pictures of the plants that you're interested in and learn from that. See what maples we have in cultivation. There may be ones that you aren't familiar with that you'd like to know more about, and you'll discover a lot of new ones that you've never figured out and people are growing that are really interested. And then figure out, what does it take to grow? What kind of soil do they like? How much water do they need? How big do they get? And all that kind of thing like that. Here's our native ones: Big Tooth, Rocky Mountain Maple, and what is that one? Box elder. You'll learn a lot about propagating trees. So learn how to grow them on your own, trees and shrubs and all different kinds of plants. Learn what it takes to recognize what it is you want to grow, what it looks like when you need to figure out what's the best time to take a cutting or gather seed. And then what do you do afterwards? How do you handle that cutting, or how do you handle that seed to make it root or germinate? And you'll be well on your way to learning about this stuff. So here's this little gallery. I'm sorry, let's go back. I went through that too quickly. It's not going to let me do this until I get all the way through it. Sorry. There. So if you go back and look at all those botanical details, you can recognize them all in this picture. That's a maple flower. It is exactly as was described there. You can even see the developing samara of the maples in the fruit right there, just even a flower that just opened. And then this is the best time to collect maple seed. If you wait until they're brown, maple seed, it's a nut. So they get a really hard outer casing that's difficult for the seedling to penetrate. And it's also got an inherent dormancy that only is uplifted if it goes through a cold treatment of a certain length and temperature period. And then they'll germinate really well. But you want to collect the seedlings, the seeds, before they develop that hard seed coat. So when they're not just newly green, but green turning to brown, you can take the wings off, and then they'll easily germinate for the next year. This is just stuff, a little list of stuff that we went over today about how I think is what is important with growing woody plants. Darren will have all this information for you after the class. I made this too. It's links to really great things. So if you want to see what CSU has available for publications, those are all really great. The botany department at UC has a great online site. This one has all kinds of information that you need to know to figure out how to propagate native plants. Denver Botanic Gardens has great online information on their website. Plant Select, I mentioned, plantselect.org. I'll just go there real quick. Can you all see this browser? Yes?
Yep, if you can just enlarge it, maybe.
Uh,
Looks like it's partial screen.
So not only do they have a list of all the plants that are in Plant Select, there's also the new ones that are coming online for next year. There's great descriptions of all the plants, what it takes to grow them, where to find them, examples of how they use, what they look like and how to use them in the landscape. And now there's this new section too that they even have finished designs that you can download or get ideas from just using Plant Select plants or any other kind of plants that are kind of like them. So that's all really great information. Plant Select is a great organization. And both Durango Botanical Gardens and the Master Gardeners are part of it. Okay, so that's pretty much it. Thank y'all.
Hey, Jeff, are you able to, I don't know if you have shared this with me, are you able to make this into a PDF and then I can share this with folks?
Yes,
Thank you. Just put it in that Dropbox folder and then I can share it out.
will do. Any
Thank
questions?
you very much.
You're welcome.
I'm in love with trees now. Thank you.
It's an
glad to
expensive,
hear it.
Likewise.
it's a very
You know-
expensive habit. I tell you what, I've spent more money on trees than I have on my
Grow your
children.
own, just like fruit trees, grow your own.
Jeff, do you ever incorporate pollinators or, that come to specific trees? Like if you're wanting to plant some trees that'll attract the most, bees and
I never used
birds
to.
and-
I do consider it now, and it's much easier to figure all that out now. The information is more readily available. As a general rule, anything in the rose family, like apples and related stuff, those are all great pollinators.
Okay.
Butterfly bush, of course. And you can even look up, I think even here on Plant Select, there's information about pollinators too. That's really good.
Okay.
So yes, definitely. It's
Thank
becoming
you.
more and more important. I mean, just think of the fire that happened in Boulder County in January of all times, or December. The butterfly pavilion was in the middle of that. I don't think it survived. So I didn't get a chance to mention too much about other kinds of native plants. That really is, I think, a whole different class in its own. And I know that Darren has one coming up that's scheduled. But if you have any questions, just ask, and I'll send you where you need to go to learn about them.
The tree that likes to grow under the ponderosa pine that's wide, is that a spruce? You have them in your yard.
Those are native Rocky Mountain junipers that are growing in our yard.
Juniper. Oh, okay. Now I've heard that they like to cluster with under the ponderosa pine.
That's because they're
And I
sown by
have that
birds.
at my house.
A bird eats the fruit.
'Cause
and
they're
then
what?
that's where they grow. A bird eats the fruit, and then a bird lands in the pine tree. That's how that happens.
Okay. So those are juniper. Okay.
Do you guys have any other questions for Jeff before we adjourn until 1 p.m. until we get our weeds talk?
There's my email if you need to reach me anyway. Well, thank you.